She didn't even look at him when she said it. "I'm going to need you to move to the back." The man in the gray jacket looked up slowly. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't done anything. He'd simply sat down in his seat, placed his worn canvas bag under the seat in front of him, and looked out the window at the tarmac below. "This section," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of professional coldness that takes years to perfect, "is reserved for our premium guests." He turned to look at her. She didn't flinch. She'd made her assessment the moment he stepped on board. Old jeans, a dark t-shirt that had been washed too many times, a gray canvas jacket with fraying at the collar, boots that had seen better years, no luggage beyond the single worn backpack, no watch visible, no signal, visible or otherwise, that this man belonged in this cabin. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. And what happened in the next 4 hours would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't have imagined, standing there in her pressed uniform, with her chin raised and her mind already made up. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G550. If you moved in certain circles in Los Angeles, you knew what that meant. It meant the kind of travel that most people only read about. Cream leather seats that reclined into full flat beds. Walnut paneling along the cabin walls. A galley stocked with things that had been selected rather than merely provided. The kind of quiet, once airborne, that felt like the world had simply agreed to leave you alone for a few hours. This particular aircraft was registered to a private holding company based in Delaware. The holding company's name appeared on no letterhead that anyone would recognize. That was intentional. The man who owned it had strong opinions about the relationship between wealth and privacy, and one of those opinions was that the two things worked considerably better when kept together rather than separated for display. The flight was departing Burbank Airport on a Tuesday morning in November, bound for Teterboro in New Jersey. From there, the passengers would be driven into Manhattan for a fundraising event that evening, a benefit for a foundation that provided emergency housing and long-term support for adults transitioning out of chronic homelessness. The organization had been operating for 11 years. It was not glamorous work. It was steady, underfunded, and necessary in the way that certain kinds of work are necessary, which is to say that without it, people who had nowhere to go would simply continue to have nowhere to go. The event had been months in the planning. It was expected to raise enough to fund an additional 3 years of operations in 2 new cities. The man whose aircraft it was had been involved in the planning from the beginning. Not as a figurehead, as someone who showed up to meetings, asked about specific outcomes, and cared whether the money went where it was meant to go. He had also, on this particular Tuesday morning, decided to board last. The passengers who had arrived before him were the kind of people that a flight attendant with 15 years in private aviation would recognize instantly as what she privately called the real thing. Arthur and Margaret Holloway were in their late 60s. Arthur had made his money over 4 decades in commercial real estate in San Diego and had spent the last 15 years giving a significant portion of it away to organizations whose work he had taken the time to actually understand. He had silver hair and a relaxed, unhurried quality. Margaret carried a small leather travel bag and had the expression of someone who had long since decided that the journey was always more interesting than the destination. They sat near the middle of the cabin, close together with the ease of two people who had spent decades choosing each other and had stopped finding it remarkable. Across the aisle from them was Daniel Sutherland, mid-50s, a film producer with credits in both studio film and documentaries that had actually changed things. He had a watchful quality that people sometimes mistook for aloofness, but which was actually just the expression of someone who was almost always paying more attention than his face suggested. He wore a well-fitted jacket and moved with unhurried confidence. He had been on this aircraft before. He knew its owner. Near the front sat Vivien Crawford, an art consultant in her early 50s who divided her time between Los Angeles and New York and operated with the particular crispness of someone who had built an entirely self-made career in an industry that was not designed to welcome self-made people. She was perfectly dressed in a way that required real thought to appear effortless. She had sharp eyes that were professionally trained to assess the actual value of things, a skill she applied to objects and situations with equal precision. These were the passengers that Diana Mercer, lead flight attendant for Clearwater Aviation, had been expecting. Clearwater Aviation was a crew services company that provided flight attendants, catering, and ground handling for private aircraft operators. Diana had been with them six years, having spent the 9 years before that with 2 other companies in the same space. She was, by any conventional measure, excellent at her job. She was organized, attentive, and carried herself with the composed authority of someone who had managed hundreds of cabins at 30,000 feet and had encountered every possible variation of difficult without losing her professional equilibrium. She knew how to read a room. She had been told this many times as a compliment. She believed it. She was also wrong about it, in a way that she had never been required to examine. She had greeted the Holloways at the top of the stairs with genuine warmth. She had shown Daniel Sutherland to his seat and noted his preference for sparkling water. She had complimented Vivien Crawford on her jacket, in a way that was both sincere and calculated, the kind of compliment that signals shared taste. She had done all of this with the smooth, practiced ease of 15 years. Then the last passenger boarded. He came up the stairs alone. No assistant. No phone pressed to his ear. No attitude. Just a man in his late 50s with dark, wavy hair threaded through with gray at the temples. A beard that had not been attended to in several days, and eyes that held a quietness that some people might have mistaken for vacancy, but was, in fact, something quite different. Something more like the deep stillness of a person who had spent a very long time learning to be present in situations without needing to perform his presence. He wore a dark t-shirt, soft from years of washing, the kind of softness that only comes from actual use rather than careful preservation. Worn jeans. Gray canvas jacket with particular character of a garment that had been on actual journeys. Old boots. A backpack over one shoulder that had clearly seen a few adventures and was not embarrassed about it. He removed his sunglasses as he entered the cabin and tucked them into his jacket pocket. His warm eyes swept across the interior, taking in the cream leather, the walnut, the other passengers, with an expression that was neither impressed nor dismissive. He simply observed, the way someone observes a room they have no need to announce themselves in. Diana Mercer looked at him. She took in the whole picture in the practiced way she had spent 15 years perfecting. The jeans, the jacket The bag, the boots, the beard, the absence of anything that would signal arrival. She gave him a curt nod and stepped aside. Nothing more. She did not offer champagne. She did not offer water. She did not offer water. She did not use his name because she had glanced at the passenger manifest that morning with enough attention to note the number of passengers, but not enough to look carefully at the final name. Or rather, and this is the more accurate version, she had seen the name, and her brain had processed it the way brains process information that doesn't fit an existing model. She had assumed coincidence, a common enough name. It couldn't be. She had moved on. The man moved down the aisle with unhurried ease. He nodded slightly to the Holloways as he passed. Margaret smiled at him warmly. He slid into the seat behind Vivien Crawford, stowed his bag beneath the seat in front, and looked out the window at the tarmac. He said nothing. He asked for nothing. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has learned over many years that waiting is often the most productive thing you can do. In the galley, a younger flight attendant named Holly Reardon stood at the counter, arranging the service items she would need for the departure sequence. Holly was 27 years old. She had been with Clearwater Aviation for 14 months, having come to the job through a combination of a genuine love of travel and the practical reality that a degree in hospitality management was easier to apply to actual hospitality than to the hotel management job she had originally wanted and hadn't been able to land. She was good at her work. Not in the way Diana was good at it. Not with the polished authority of 15 years, but with a different quality, a sincerity, an instinct for what people actually needed rather than what the service protocol said they should receive. She had watched Diana's greeting, or the thing that had substituted for a greeting, from the galley doorway. She had watched Diana's eyes move over the man in the gray jacket. She had watched the nod, the step aside, the nothing more. Something uncomfortable settled in Holly's chest. She had felt something similar before, watching Diana work. She had felt it and named it to herself, and then said it's because Diana was her supervisor. And the practical mathematics of employment had, on those previous occasions, overridden the instinct to say something. She thought about saying something now. She thought about walking out to the cabin and greeting the man herself, offering him the water or coffee that Diana had not offered. She stood in the doorway and thought about this, and while she was thinking about it, Diana came back into the galley to prepare for the departure service, and the moment passed. Holly told herself she would watch how the flight developed. She would not have to wait long. The aircraft lifted off the Burbank runway on a Tuesday morning in November, with the particular smoothness of an aircraft built to make the entire process feel effortless. Below, Los Angeles spread outward in every direction. Its freeways and neighborhoods, and the particular kind of horizontal ambition that defines the city's geography at altitude. Through the oval windows, the view shrank and receded as they climbed, the sprawl tracting into something that looked, from up here, almost manageable. The man in the gray jacket watched this without expression. He had flown over this city hundreds of times. In the early years, on commercial flights in coat pressed against the window on red eyes, exhausted and uncertain about where things were going. In the middle years, in business class, on longer trips to locations where films were being made. In the later years, in aircraft like this one, which he had never quite gotten used to, and had made his peace with by attaching conditions to the comfort condition about how the aircraft staffed, how it was operated, and whether the people who boarded it were treated as well by its crew as they would have wanted to be treated themselves. He had learned, through specific and sometimes disappointing experience, that creating those conditions in advance was less reliable than testing them, which was why, on a Tuesday in November, he was wearing a gray canvas jacket and waiting to see what would happen. Diana moved through the cabin with practiced grace. Once they reached cruising altitude, the sequence was smooth and professional and completely revealing. She stopped at Vivien Crawford's seat. Champagne? Sparkling water? Something to eat. She was warm. She was attentive. She asked about a previous flight they had overlapped on and remembered a detail about Vivien's preference for the temperature of the cabin. She moved to the holloways. Arthur received his sparkling water with a slice of lemon without having asked for it, because Diana had noted his preference from the service sheet. Margaret was asked about her journey in a way that felt genuine. She exchanged a few words with Daniel Sutherland. His sparkling water arrived. She checked the temperature of the cabin at his end. Then she walked straight past the man in the gray jacket. Not a glance, not a pause, nothing. He watched her go. He said nothing. He turned back to the window. 20 minutes passed. Across the aisle, Daniel Sutherland had looked up from his phone. He was watching Diana's movements with the particular attention of someone who has begun to understand a pattern. He said nothing. He was waiting, the way certain kinds of people wait, with full intention of acting when the time was right. Margaret Holloway had also looked up from her knitting. She caught her husband's eye. The glance between them contained a full conversation. In the galley, Holly had made a glass of water. She had made it the moment she'd noticed that Diana had not. She stood at the counter with the glass in her hand and thought about what she was going to do with it. She was still thinking about this when the man raised his hand. It was a small gesture, unhurried. He wasn't flagging anyone down. He raised his hand the way you raise it when you are making an effort not to be demanding about something you need. Diana was at the forward end of the cabin. She saw it. She finished what she was doing. She walked toward him, unhurried, with the smooth pace of someone who has decided how much speed this request deserves. "Could I get a glass of water?" he asked. His voice was quiet, no entitlement in it, no edge. Just a simple request made politely by someone who has been waiting for a while and is trying not to make it anyone's problem. Diana looked at him with an expression that was professionally controlled but carried beneath it something that was not. "When I have a moment," she said. She walked back to the galley. Holly was standing there with the glass already poured. Diana looked at her. "What's that?" "Water, for the passenger in the back. I'll bring it." Holly handed her the glass. Diana set it on the counter. She did not pick it up again. She began reorganizing the service cart, rearranging items that did not need rearranging, that had already been checked. Holly watched her for a moment. Then she looked at the glass sitting on the counter. Then she looked at the cabin. 15 minutes passed. The glass sat on the counter. When the man raised his hand a second time, it was with the same small, deliberate gesture as the first. No demand, no impatience visible, just the gesture of someone who understands that they are going to have to ask again, and has decided to do so without making it an incident. Diana was in the galley. She saw the raised hand through the galley doorway. She came out. She walked toward him. She stopped at Vivien Crawford's seat on the way to ask if she needed anything. She genuinely did not seem to notice the irony of this. Then she stepped forward to where the man sat. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. Not the formulaic sorry, but the genuine version, the one that acknowledges that he is about to inconvenience someone. "Just water whenever you have a moment." Diana looked at him, and something that had been building in her, the accumulated discomfort of the Holloways watching, of Vivien's earlier comment, of Daniel Sutherland's silent attention, came out in a way she could not quite control. "I have a number of passengers to attend to," she said. Her voice was controlled, but the temperature beneath it was not. "I'll get to everyone in turn." "Of course," he said. "Take your time." She turned to go. "Miss." It was Margaret Holloway. Her voice was gentle. The voice of someone who has been gentle for a long time and knows how far gentleness can travel. Diana turned. "The gentleman has asked twice," Margaret said. "For water, that's all." Diana opened her mouth. "My wife is right," Arthur said, setting aside his magazine. He was not angry. He was the version of something stronger than anger, which is simply clear. "It's a glass of water, whatever system of priorities you're operating with. It's hard to see how water for a thirsty passenger ranks below whatever you've been doing." The cabin was very still. Vivien Crawford had set down her champagne glass. She was watching Diana with the evaluating eyes of someone who is revising an assessment downward. Daniel Sutherland had put his phone face down on the armrest. He was watching. Diana's face was carefully controlled. But something moved behind it. "I understand your concern," she said. "I'm attending to all of our guests." "You're attending to some of them," Vivien said. Flat, precise. The way she delivered assessments professionally. "This gentleman is not among the ones you're attending to." That's fairly observable. The man in the gray jacket said nothing through any of this. He sat with his hands rested lightly on his thighs, and his expression open and his gaze steady. He was not performing patience, he was simply patient, which was somehow worse for Diana than performance would have been. She looked at him. "Fine," she said, and the word carried more than it should have. She went to the galley. She picked up the glass. Holly had poured 30 minutes ago. She came back. She stood before him. He looked up at her. And Diana Mercer, lead flight attendant, with 15 years in private aviation, in the grip of something she had not chosen but could not stop, looked at this man and made the decision that would define the rest of her professional life. She threw the water in his face. Not all of it reached him. Some of it went onto the seat, on some onto the window. The rest went across his face, soaking his hair, running down his cheeks, darkening the front of his t-shirt in a spreading stain. The cabin went absolutely silent, not the careful, waiting silence of a room paying attention. The stunned, total silence of a room that has just watched something irreversible happen and has not yet processed what it means. Diana stood holding the empty glass. Her hand was shaking. She had not planned it. That was the thing she would spend months trying to understand. She had not walked to the galley with intention. She had walked to the galley with anger, which is different. And the anger had been there when she picked up the glass. And something in the crossing of the distance between the galley and his seat had made her cross another distance that was much harder to come back from. In the galley doorway, Holly Reardon had gone completely still. Her hands were pressed flat against the counter behind her. Her face had gone pale. She had watched it happen from 20 feet away and had not been able to intervene in time, and was now standing in the aftermath with something close to horror on her face. Margaret Holloway had both hands pressed to her mouth. Arthur had half risen from his seat. Vivien Crawford was sitting perfectly upright, her champagne glass abandoned, her face wearing an expression that contained shock and something darker than shock. Daniel Sutherland was on his feet. The man in the gray jacket sat completely still. Water dripped from his hair onto his soaked shirt. He raised one hand, slowly, and wiped the water from his eyes with the back of it. Then he reached up and took off his baseball cap, which he had pulled on at some point during the flight, and set it carefully on the armrest beside him. He looked at Diana. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. It had not changed. "That," he said, "was a choice you're going to need to think about for a long time." Diana was still holding the empty glass. She was breathing. That was approximately all she was doing. "You should know something," he said. He said it to the cabin as much as to Diana. "This aircraft belongs to me. The people on board are my guests. I boarded last, dressed this way, to see how the crew would treat a passenger who didn't look wealthy." He paused. "I've done it before. Usually it tells me things I already suspected. Today it told me something I hoped not to learn." Vivien Crawford let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, but contained something of the same release of pressure. "He's telling you," Arthur Holloway said to Diana, his voice very quiet. "Who he is. I'd suggest you listen." Diana's lips were moving. No sound came out. Daniel Sutherland sat back down slowly. He looked at the man in the gray jacket, at this man whose name he had known from the beginning, whose identity the Holloways had known from the beginning, whose guests they all were. And something that had been waiting to become a smile finally allowed itself to. Not because anything was funny, because there was something in the quality of the man's stillness, even soaking wet, even in this moment, that contained the whole of the story and everything the story was about. In the galley doorway, Holly finally moved. She grabbed a clean towel from the stack and walked into the cabin and stood before him. "I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice was barely steady. "I am so deeply sorry for what just happened. Please let me—" "Thank you," he said, accepting the towel. He looked at her directly. "This isn't your fault." "I could have." "It isn't your fault," he said again, with finality and without unkindness. He dried his face slowly. He dried his hair as best he could. He draped the towel over the armrest, and then he turned to look at Diana, who was still standing in the aisle with the empty glass, and his expression was not angry, not triumphant, not any of the emotions the situation might have justified. It was something closer to sad. "You should sit down," he said. "We'll talk about this when we land." Diana sat down. She sat in the jump seat at the front of the cabin and stared at the floor, and did not move for the rest of the flight. And the man in the gray jacket, Keanu Reeves, as the Holloways and Daniel and Vivien already knew, as Diana had just understood, as Holly was in the process of understanding, turned back to the window and watched the desert pass below, and said nothing more until they landed. Teterboro Airport in November is the particular gray of a New Jersey afternoon that has decided to take no position on anything. The sky was flat and cool. The Manhattan skyline showed in the middle distance, its towers the color of old silver. A conference room in the private terminal had been made available on short notice. Glass walls, a long table, the quiet efficiency of a space designed for conversations that mattered. The passengers settled in. Arthur and Margaret, together at one end, close as always. Vivien across from them, composed but attentive. Daniel standing near the window with his arms loose at his sides. Holly had followed the group off the aircraft, with the uncertain step of someone who wasn't sure whether she belonged in this room, but who had understood instinctively that what happened next mattered enough, that she had to be present for it. Diana Mercer sat alone at the far end of the table. She had changed nothing about her appearance. Her uniform was still immaculate, which somehow made it worse. This precision of presentation, maintained in the aftermath of something that had been precisely the opposite of precise. She had not spoken since the aircraft. She had helped with the landing sequence, with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose hands remembered their job, while the rest of them was somewhere else entirely. She had walked through the terminal and into the conference room and sat down, and she had been sitting in the same posture since. Straight, controlled, hands folded, looking at the table. A representative from Clearwater Aviation had arrived. His name was Michael Parrish. He was in his early 50s, a careful man with careful eyes who had been in aviation management for 20 years, who had been in aviation management. From his office to the terminal, spent the car rides to the terminal, full understanding that the conversation he'd had in recent memory, or in recent antied memory. Keanu came in last. He had changed his shirt in the aircraft lavatory. He was otherwise the same. Jeans, boots, the gray canvas jacket. He looked in all the ways that mattered exactly like himself. He sat down. He looked around the table. He did not perform seriousness. He was simply serious, in the way that certain people are simply things, because they are, not because they are presenting themselves as being. "I want to talk about what happened today," he said. "Not to punish anyone, because I think there are things that deserve to be said, and I want to say them." He turned to Diana. "I'm going to start with you," he said. "Not because you're the only person in this room who has something to answer for today. You're not." He glanced at Holly briefly. "But you're the one who made the decisions that led us here." Diana nodded. She was looking at him. It had taken visible effort to lift her eyes from the table, but she had done it. "I've been in this industry," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. 15 years. And in 15 years, I have assessed every single passenger who walked onto a private aircraft by what they were wearing and how they looked. I have done it automatically. I have told myself it was professional instinct. I have told myself it was reading the room. She stopped. Today I understood for the first time what reading the room actually meant. What I was actually doing. She pressed her lips together. I was deciding who deserved to be comfortable. The room was quiet. Not who needed service, she continued. Not who had asked for something. Who deserved it. And I was making that decision before anyone said a word, based on clothes, based on a bag, based on whether someone looked like my picture of who belonged on a private jet. She looked at Keanu directly. "You were wearing an old jacket and carrying a backpack, and you asked me for water twice, and I left you sitting there." "You did," he said. "And then She stopped. Started again. "What? I need you to understand that I have been going over that moment since it happened, trying to understand it, and the only thing I can tell you is that I had been angry for the whole flight, and nowhere to put it, And when I walked to the galley to get the water, I had already decided. I wasn't going to give it to you with any grace. And by the time I got to you, the anger and the humiliation of being challenged in front of the passengers had. She stopped. It doesn't matter. I threw water in your face. There's no version of the explanation that changes what I did. No, he agreed. There isn't. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's not sufficient. I know it. It's a start, he said. He leaned forward slightly. I want to tell you something about why I did this, he said. Why I boarded last, dressed this way, without announcing who I was, because it wasn't a trap. I want you to understand that. She looked at him. I've been testing cabin crews for years, he said. Not systematically, not as a formal program. Just. I fly regularly, and I've been concerned for a long time about the way service in private aviation distributes itself. The way some passengers receive full, generous human attention, and some passengers receive the minimum required to justify a paycheck. I've been on the receiving end of both, depending on what I'm wearing. And it's told me something about the industry that I haven't known how to address directly. He paused. What you did today was an extreme version of what happens on most of those flights. The water, specifically, that was unusual. But the underlying thing, the sorting, the deciding before anyone speaks who deserves that's not unusual. That's the norm. And I want to do something about the norm. Michael Parrish, the Clearwater representative, spoke carefully. Mr. Reeves, on behalf of Clearwater Aviation, I want to offer our complete apology for Miss Mercer's conduct today. Her employment with us is terminated, effective. Keanu held up one hand. I know, he said. And that's not negotiable. That's a consequence of what happened, and it has to happen. He looked at Diana as he said it directly and without softening it. I want you to understand that clearly. Your contract with this aircraft and with my company's flights is finished. Diana absorbed this. She had known it was coming. Knowing it didn't make it smaller. But termination alone, Keanu continued, doesn't address anything. It doesn't change what happens on the next flight, on the next 100 flights. With the next version of you in 15 years of the same habits, with a different airline and different passengers and the same invisible sorting criteria. He paused. I've watched careers end because someone made a bad decision. What I haven't seen enough of is careers end and then something useful come from it. He looked at Diana steadily. There's a training program I've been trying to fund for 2 years. At the USC Marshall School. It's a curriculum specifically designed for hospitality professionals, flight attendants, hotel staff, high-end retail, about the psychology of appearance-based judgment. How it forms, how it justifies itself, how it resists being named. He paused. The person who runs it is a professor named Carol Stanhope, who has spent 23 years studying this specific phenomenon in service environments. She's been looking for someone to help develop the practical module, someone with real experience of the thing from the inside. Diana stared at him. You have 15 years of it, he said. You know how the thinking forms. You know the language it uses to justify itself. You know what it looks like when you're inside it and can't see it clearly. That knowledge is actually useful if you're willing to use it honestly. The room was very quiet. Why would you offer me that? Diana said, after today. Keanu looked at her for a long moment. Because I've been in rooms where someone gave me a chance I hadn't earned, he said, and it changed things. Not instantly, not cleanly, but it changed things. He paused. I don't know if you'll take this and do something real with it, or whether you'll take it and go through the motions and learn nothing. I can't know that. You can't even know that yet. But I think the chance is worth more than the certainty of nothing. Diana looked at the table. Then she looked up. I'll take it, she said. I'll take it seriously. I don't know what else I can tell you right now, except that. That's enough, he said. He turned to Michael Parrish. I want a formal service standard written into every Clearwater contract for flights on my aircraft, he said. It's simple. Every passenger receives the same initial greeting, the same offer of refresh, the same attentiveness, no differentiation based on appearance, attire, or perceived economic status. No sorting at the door. If a passenger explicitly requests privacy and minimal interaction, that's respected. But that has to be the passenger's request, not a unilateral decision by the crew about who deserves what. Parrish nodded. We can have that written by the end of the week. Good. Keanu turned to the room. I'm also going to be conducting unannounced quality check-checks on any charter service that uses my aircraft. Not because I enjoy this process, because the alternative is not knowing. He looked at Vivien Crawford. You said something earlier on the flight, he said, about being able to observe what Diana was doing. Vivien nodded. I said she was tending to some passengers. Not all of them. It was accurate. You've been on contracted charter flights for 20 years, he said. How often does what you saw today happen? Vivien was quiet for a moment. More than it should, she said carefully, less dramatically than today. But the underlying pattern, certain passengers receiving a different quality of attention, I've seen it more times than I've said anything about. Why didn't you say anything? Another pause. Because it wasn't my place. Because the person receiving the lesser service wasn't complaining. Because I told myself it was the airline's problem, not mine. She looked at her hands briefly, which is, I think, its own version of the same problem. Keanu nodded. Yes. It is. He turned to Holly. She had been standing near the door through the entire conversation, present but peripheral, the way junior people are present in rooms where senior people have things to settle. She looked at him with the expression of someone who is not sure what is coming and has decided to meet it honestly rather than defensively. You poured the water the first time, he asked? Margaret Holloway said from her end of the table. Her voice was gentle and absolutely certain. She had been watching Holly from the moment they'd entered the room. I saw you. You had it ready. And Diana told you to go back. Holly looked at Margaret, then at Keanu. I did, she said. I stood in the galley with a glass of water for 20 minutes waiting for her to take it, and when she didn't, I brought it myself. And she told you to go back to the galley. Yes. And you went. A pause. Why? Holly took a breath. Because she's my supervisor. Because I'd already had one conversation with her about this kind of thing on a previous flight, and the way that conversation ended made me afraid of having it again. Because I was 27 years old and I needed my job. She paused. Those things are all true. None of them make it the right decision. No, Keanu said. They don't. But they make it an understandable one. He paused. What changed? What made you bring the water the second time anyway? Holly thought about it carefully. I realized I was standing there thinking about whether to do the right thing, she said. And I understood that the fact that I was thinking about it, that I hadn't just automatically done it, meant I'd already made the wrong decision once. And I didn't want to make it again. The room absorbed this. "I want to make you an offer," Keanu said. "There's a peer review process for service quality that I've been trying to get aviation companies to adopt for years. A system where flight attendants have a confidential channel to flag service standard concerns without going through the standard chain of command, where junior staff aren't required to choose between their ethics and their employment." He looked at Michael Parrish. "I want Clearwater to pilot it." Parrish looked at him. "That would require some structural. I'll fund the development," Keanu said. "I want Holly involved in designing it." Holly blinked. "You understand the problem from the ground level," Keanu said to her. "You know what it costs a junior employee to speak up. You know the specific texture of that decision. That's what the system needs to be built around." "I've never designed a policy process," Holly said. "Carol Stanhope's program will connect you with someone who has," he said. "What you bring is the experiences. That's the part that can't be taught from the outside." He looked around the table at all of them. "I've been flying for 30 years, he said. "Commercial, charter, private. I've been in coach with my knees against the seat in front of me, and I've been in cabins like the one we flew in today. And what I've noticed over 30 years is that the thing that makes a flight good or bad has almost nothing to do with the leather seats or the champagne or the catering." He paused. "It has to do with whether the person bringing you water sees you as a person or as a category." He let that sit. Every person on an aircraft, every person in any service environment is a person, not a signal of their own economic status, not a reflection of what they appear to be worth. A person who is hungry or thirsty or cold or tired or scared or any one of 100 ordinary human things, and who deserves to be treated accordingly, regardless of what they're wearing. He stood up. That's what today was about. In the end, that's the whole of it. The benefit that evening was held in a converted warehouse in the West Village, the kind of space that had been ugly in a previous industrial life and was now beautiful in the particular way of New York spaces that have been loved into something worth keeping. Long tables, candles in the center, food that was simple and excellent, people who had come not to be seen, but because they cared about the work. Keanu arrived in the same clothes he'd been wearing all day. No one commented on this. Several people who recognized him greeted him with the warmth of genuine familiarity, the kind that doesn't require anything from the other person. He shook hands and asked questions, and listened to the answers with the full attention that people who spent time with him always noted as his most striking quality. He did not make a speech. When the program director asked if he wanted to say a few words, he shook his head. "The speakers tonight have the words," he told her. "Better ones than I'd manage." He stayed until the last guest left. He helped fold tables. He was given a look for this that suggested it was unusual. He folded tables anyway. On the walk to the cars afterward, Daniel Sutherland fell in beside him. "Good day?" Daniel asked. "Instructive," Keanu said. "The flight?" "Yes." They walked for a moment. "You were patient with her," Daniel said. "More patient than she had any right to expect." Keanu thought about this. "I've been in rooms where someone's patience with me changed what I understood about myself," he said. "At moments when punishment would have been more satisfying to deliver and less useful to receive." He glanced at Danielle. "I don't think patience is the word, exactly. It wasn't about being gentle. It was about wanting what came out of it to mean something. Punishment doesn't always produce understanding. Sometimes it produces bitterness, and bitterness doesn't change anything. Do you think she'll change? Daniel asked. Actually change. Keanu was quiet for a while. I think she understood something today that she's going to have to live with, regardless, he said. What she does with the living with it, I don't know. I can't know. He looked up at the New York sky, which was showing a few stars through the light pollution. But I think there's a difference between understanding something and not understanding it. And today she understood something. He paused. That seems worth the cost. Diana Ferser called the USCC Marshall School of Business on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the flight. She had spent those 10 days in the specific discomfort of a person who has been required, for the first time in a long time, to look at themselves accurately. Not the version of herself she presented to the world, not the competent, composed, 15-year veteran. The version who had walked through a cabin deciding, flight after flight after flight, who deserved what. She had gone through her memory with the care that the situation demanded. The man who had boarded a flight out of Van Nuys in work clothes and asked, apologetically, if there was anything available to eat. She had told him the food service had concluded. It had not concluded. She had concluded it for him. The couple who had boarded a flight from Las Vegas in matching wind purrs and received, for the duration of the flight, the minimum that could be described as service. They had been polite and grateful for what little they got. She had not thought about them after they deplaned. The woman traveling alone, mid-40s, nothing distinguishing about her appearances, who had asked whether she could change seats to one with more light because she was trying to read, and who Diana had told the seating arrangement was fixed. The seating arrangement had not been fixed. She had simply not wanted to accommodate someone she had decided didn't merit the additional effort. She went through more. There were more. When she called the program office, she asked to speak to Professor Carol Stanhope directly. She was told Professor Stanhope was available. She introduced herself. She said she had been referred through a private donor's office. She said she understood the program was looking for a practitioner to help develop the applied module. Someone with real-world experience of the behaviors the curriculum addressed. She said, I'm someone who did the thing you're trying to prevent. For 15 years, systematically, in hundreds of cabins, without once examining it clearly. I think I can explain how it forms from the inside, and why it's so resistant to examination, and what it feels like when you can finally see it. A pause on the line. Can you come in Monday? Professor Stanhope asked. Diana said she could. The curriculum she helped develop over the following months was built around a question she had arrived at during those 10 days of internal accounting. The question was, when did you learn that certain people deserved less? Because nobody arrived at that conclusion independently. Nobody was born knowing which clothes corresponded, which levsanthus, or which bags signaled worthiness and which signaled its absence. The criteria came from somewhere, from an industry that organized itself, often implicitly of wealth and explicitly around signals of wealth and status, from training that valorized certain passengers without examining why, from 1,000 small confirmations over a career that the assessment was accurate, and the hierarchy was legitimate, and the sorting was professional rather than prejudicial. The curriculum asked, what if it isn't? Diana ran the sessions herself. Not alone. Professor Stanhope was always present for the first iteration at any new location, and there were co-facilitators for the applied components. But Diana ran the part of the curriculum that was hers specifically, the testimony section, the part where someone who had done the thing explained, in specific and unflinching detail, how it had worked from the inside. She found it harder than she expected. She had expected it to become easier with repetition. It did not. Each time she described the flight attendant who decided in 3 seconds who deserved a glass of water, she was describing herself, and the audience knew it, and the honest ones in the room recognized something in the description that was also true of themselves. And the recognition was what made the room change. She ran the sessions in Clearwater Aviation's new employee training. She ran them in partnership programs with 2 hotel chains. She ran them for the security division of a luxury retail association. She did not call it redemption. She did not use that language because she had decided that the language of redemption placed the emphasis in the wrong place. It made it about her feeling better. She was not primarily interested in feeling better. She was interested in the 800 people, by her count at 18 months in, who had sat in a room and been asked to examine something they had not previously examined. Some of whom had pushed back, initially that people push back when they are being asked to look at something uncomfortable. Some of whom had dismissed it. Some of whom had left the session and continued exactly as before, but some of whom had not. Some of whom had gone back to their cabins and their front desks and their service counters and had done something different, had brought water without waiting, had offered the same greeting to the man in the windbreaker as to the man in the suit, had noticed the moment of sorting before it became action and had interrupted it. Those people Diana didn't hear about, generally. The nature of change that happens in small moments is that it doesn't produce reports. It just changes the temperature of the rooms slightly for per person in the windbreaker who sits down and is brought water without having to ask. But she knew it was happening. She was certain of this, not from evidence, but from the specific qualifications, the recognition in certain faces, the moment when a room stopped being resistant and started being honest, and from the knowledge that this was how it actually worked, not in dramatic reversals, in incremental recalibrations of what the person across from you is worth. 6 months after the flight, Keanu received a message through the program coordinator. It was brief. 3 paragraphs. It said that the writer had completed her first full cycle of the curriculum, that she had run 43 sessions across 5 organizations, that she had been, in each session, as honest as she knew how to be, about what she had done and why and how it had looked from the inside. It said, "I'm not going to tell you I understand what I did to you on that flight. I mean that I understood it abstractly. I understand the mechanics of it, the psychology of it, the 15 years of unchallenged habit that led to it. But the water in your face, the specific act, the irreversibility of it, I don't think I'll ever be at peace with that. And I'm not sure I should be." And then, "What I can tell you is that I stood in front of 43 rooms of people who do what I did, and I told them the truth. I didn't manage it or soften it or present a version of myself that was easier to look at. I told them who I was and what I did and what it took to see it." A pause visible in the white space. "I hope that means something. Even if it's not enough, He sat with the message at the kitchen table in his house in the Hollywood Hills, with the Los Angeles morning coming through the window the way it always did, patient and golden and indifferent to everything except being itself. He thought about a Tuesday in November above the California desert. He thought about what water dripping from a person's face looks like. The person is dripping from has decided not to be undone by it. He thought, she's right that it's not enough. Some things aren't enough. They're just the work you have and you do it. He typed 3 words. Keep going. Please. He sent it. He finished his coffee. Holly Reardon had called the number on the card within a week of the flight. She had thought about it carefully before calling. Not about whether to call. She had known almost immediately that she would, but about what she was going to say. She had not wanted to call with nothing. She had wanted to arrive at the conversation having already done something, with the impulse that the flight had catalyzed. So she had spent the week writing 8 pages. The first 2 were about the specific flight, what she had observed, what she had done, what she had not done, and why. The next 3 were about the 14 months before the flight, the pattern she had watched repeat itself in various forms, the times she had stayed silent, the cost of that, and understood it retrospectively. The final 3 were about a proposal, a peer review system for service quality, a confidential channel for junior staff, a formal mechanism that would allow the person with the glass in their hand to flag what was happening without having to choose between their ethics and their rent. When she called, she introduced herself. Then she said, "I've written something I'd like to send you before we talk. Is there an address?" There was an address. She sent the document. 3 days later, someone from the administrative office called and connected her with Professor Stanhope's office at USC Marshall. She met with Professor Stanhope and 2 members of the curriculum team. She was 27 years old. She had a degree in hospitality management and 14 months of experience. She was aware, acutely, that she had neither the credentials nor the authority that the room was accustomed to. She was also the only person in the room who could explain from specific personal experience what it felt like to stand in a galley with a glass in your hand and decide whether to walk out against your supervisor's instructions. The texture of that decision, the weight of it, the specific fear that made it possible to stand there for 20 minutes instead of simply walking forward. That was what the program needed, not the policy architecture. Policy architects were available. What was harder to find was the experiential knowledge of where systems failed the people they were designed to protect, and why, and what the failure looked like from the position of least power. Holly provided that. The peer review system took 8 months to develop and pilot. It was imperfect. The first version had flaws that the second version corrected. The second version had flaws that the third version addressed. By the third version, 3 other aviation companies had asked to license the framework. Holly was listed as a co-developer. She was 28 years old. The wooden sign had been at the USC Marshall Program Office from the beginning. Diana hadn't noticed it the first time she walked in. She noticed it on the 3rd session, when she arrived early and was sitting alone in the room and had nothing to do but look at the walls. It was small, plain wood. Someone had burned the words into it with something that made the letters irregular and real. It read, Every person who walks through the door deserves water when they ask for it. She sat looking at it for a long time. She would learn later that Keanu had sent it, not with any ceremony or explanation, just a package delivered to the program office, with no note beyond the item itself. She understood what it meant, not as a rebuke, as a reminder. The kind of reminder that is addressed not to who you were, but to who you were trying to become. She thought, yes, that's the whole of it. That is the rule that contains all the other rules. That is the standard that, once you have actually internalized it, makes the sorting unnecessary, because there is no sorting. There is only the person in front of you and the water they have asked for, and the decision about whether you see them. She had spent 15 years not seeing them. She was learning. There are things this story asks of the person hearing it. Not many things. Just one, really, though it has many faces. It asks you to look at the invisible decisions. The ones you've made about who is worth your full attention and who is worth a diminished version of it. The ones that happened so fast you barely registered them as decisions at all. The ones that felt like reading a room rather than judging a person. Most of us will never be caught the way Diana was caught. The person in the wrong shoes will receive less service and leave without knowing why, and the flight will land and the day will end, and no one will ever name what happened. The pattern continues because it is invisible, and it is invisible because it has been dressed in the language of professionalism and experience and instinct. But the person in the wrong shoes felt it. They felt the difference in the pour of the water. They felt the moment when the eyes went over them and decided. They felt the particular quality of being seen as less than you are, which is one of the oldest and most specific forms of harm one person can do to another, and which costs nothing to inflict and something real to receive. You will never be in a position to know how much it cost, which means the only reasonable position is to act as if it costs everything, because to the person receiving it, it often does. Every person who walks through the door, every single one. That is the rule. That is the whole of it. And it turns out that once you have genuinely internalized it, once you have stopped seeing it as a constraint and started seeing it as a standard, everything that follows from it becomes simple, not easy. Simple. And that distinction is worth everything. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what stayed with you. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you. There is a photograph in Holly Reardon's office. It is not framed dramatically. It sits on the small credenza behind her desk in a plain frame among a handful of other photographs. Her family at Thanksgiving, her college graduation, shot from a trip to Sedona that she takes out occasionally to remind herself that the world is larger than any single room. The photograph in the plain frame was taken by Arthur Holloway on the day of the benefit, not on the aircraft. In the West Village, after the event, on the sidewalk outside the warehouse where the evening had been held, someone had handed Arthur a phone and asked him to take a group photograph, and he had done so, with the patient attention of a man who understood that some moments deserved to be captured carefully. It shows Keanu and the Holloways and Daniel and Vivien and Holly standing in the November evening with the Manhattan light behind them. Keanu is still wearing the gray jacket and the worn jeans. Holly is standing beside him with the slightly stunned expression of someone who is present at a moment that they have not yet fully processed. She does not look at the photograph every day. She looks at it on certain days. The days when the pull toward conformity feels stronger than usual. The days when the practical arguments for staying quiet have arranged themselves into a sufficiently persuasive case. The days when she is in a meeting or a corridor or a conversation and she can feel the moment approaching. The moment when she could say something and it might cost her something, and the easiest path is to not say it. She looks at the photograph. She remembers the galley, the glass of water, the 20 minutes she stood there. She remembers walking out. Then she says the thing every time. Arthur Holloway told the story at a dinner party 3 months after the flight. Not as an entertainment. He told it because someone at the table, a woman in her 60s who ran a national hotel chain, had been talking about the challenge of consistency in service standards across different demographics of clientele. Arthur had listened to the conversation for a while. Then he had told the story of a Tuesday in November, simply and without decoration, from the man in a gray jacket had boarded last and sat down near the window to the moment the same man, still in the same gray jacket, had stood up in a conference room at Teterboro and said, "Every person who walks through the door." The table had been quiet when he finished. The woman who ran the hotel chain had looked at her wineglass for a long moment. "That's the whole problem, isn't it?" she said, not as a question. "We train for the visible things, speed and accuracy, and product knowledge and upselling and all the rest of it. But we don't train for the invisible thing, the decision about who the training applies to." Arthur had nodded. "She's doing it now," he said. "The flight attendant. She's helping develop a program that trains for exactly that." The hotel chain executive had asked for the program's contact information. She implemented a version of it in her property's new staff onboarding within 6 months. Arthur never told Keanu about this. He didn't think it was necessary. Things that spread from honest conversation tend to find their own level without being managed. Arthur had spent enough years in business to understand the difference between organic and directed change, and to trust the former when the conditions for it existed. The conditions in this case existed. Margaret Holloway wrote in her journal that night. She had kept the journal for 40 years. It was not a daily practice, more like a periodic accounting, a way of settling what had happened into words clear enough to examine. She wrote about the flight, about the moment Diana had walked past a thirsty man 4 times, about the water, about Keanu's face afterward, and the particular quality of his stillness, and the way he had spoken in the conference room, without heat and without theater. She wrote, "What I will remember most about today is that it was not dramatic in the way that stories about justice are usually dramatic. There was no moment of spectacular reversal. There was no humiliation answered with counter-humiliation. There was a man who had been treated as though he did not matter, who then had the opportunity to treat the person who had done it in any way he chose, and who chose to treat her as though she still could." She underlined the last word. She looked at it for a while. She wrote, "I have spent a long time believing that the quality of a person is visible in how they treat the people below them. What today taught me is that the quality of a person's may be most visible in how they treat the person who has just failed them, that this is the hardest test. Because the person who has failed you has given you every reason to stop extending the assumption of their worth. And extending it anyway when you don't have to, when no one would fault you for withdrawing it. That is the thing. She closed the journal. She lay in the dark of the hotel room, with Arthur's breathing steady beside her, and thought about the wooden sign she had not yet seen, but would see later, when she visited the approach at USEC Marshall at Keanu's invitation, as a guest speaker to a session on what it looked to witness injustice from the outside. She would speak simply and directly about what she had watched. She would tell them about the moment she had spoken up. The small, insufficient, belated moment of calling Diana's name, and about why it had taken her that long. About the calculation she had run in her head in the seconds before she spoke. About how even she, with 68 years of experience and no professional stake in the situation, had felt the pull toward staying quiet. She would tell them that staying quiet is always the easier path in the moment and always the more expensive one in the long run. She would tell them that the cost of staying quiet is paid by the person standing there thirsty. She would tell them to remember that. Vivien Crawford made 2 phone calls the following week. The first was to a colleague at a gallery in Chicago who used charter services regularly. She described the service standard Keanu had proposed and asked whether the colleague would be willing to put it in writing as a requirement for contracted flights. The colleague said she would. The second call was to the Luxury Retail Association, whose board she sat on. She proposed adding service quality auditing with specific attention to appearance-based differential service as a line item in the association's annual member review. This was more complicated. There were people on either the board who were comfortable with the status quo in ways that made them resistant to naming what the status quo actually was. Vivien had encountered before. She knew the particular quality of resistance that organizes itself around languid and not subjective and complex, and not straightforwardly measurable. She made the case anyway. The vote was 7-4 in favor of adding the audit. Vivien was not the kind of person who said she was pleased with herself. She had never found self-satisfaction useful. She noted the outcome, moved to the next item on her agenda, and later that evening told her partner over dinner that something she'd been on a plea done, that she'd led to a small thing she'd done that she thought was probably the right thing. Her partner asked whether she wanted to talk about it. She said not particularly. She said it was just someone being treated as though they didn't matter, and someone else deciding that wasn't acceptable. She looked at her dinner. I decided it was not acceptable either, a little late. But I decided it. Her partner said, that's not nothing. No, she agreed, it's not nothing. The wooden sign that Keanu had sent to the USC Marshall Program office became, in its small way, the center of a tradition. Each new cohort of the curriculum, each group of service industry professionals who came through the program, ended their final session by looking at the sign and being asked a simple question. The question was, do you understand why this is the rule? Not what the rule means, not how to implement it, whether you understand why. Because the why was the thing that Diana had spent 15 years not understanding. She had known the what. Bring water when asked, in the technical sense. She had known it as a sequence. What she had not known was the why. which was that the person asking for the water was a person fully and completely before anything else. Before their clothes or their bag or their apparent economic station, before any of the signals that 15 years of training had taught her to read as indicators of worthiness. Before all of that, a person with thirst, with hunger, with the ordinary need to be seen and attended to by the person whose job it was to do exactly that. The curriculum didn't ask people to pretend the signals weren't there. It didn't pretend that human beings weren't wired to sort, or that institutional training hadn't reinforced certain kinds of sorting over others. It asked something harder than pretending. It asked people to notice the sort before it became action, to catch themselves in the 3-second window, and to choose in that window to see the person rather than the assessment. Some of them could do this immediately and without particular effort. Some of them could do it most of the time. Some of them struggled with it persistently and honestly, and made partial progress that was still more than no progress. And a very few left the room having intellectually processed the material and made change at all. Diana had learned to recognize which was which by the particular quality of how people sat during the testimony section. The ones who were going to change sat differently from the ones who were going to nod and continue. She could not have explained the difference precisely. She could see it. She ran the sessions anyway. For everyone. Because the ratio that mattered was not perfect change to no change. It was change to what would have happened without the conversation. And that ratio, she was certain, was worth the effort of having it. The last thing. On a morning in April, several months after the November flight, Keanu boarded his aircraft at Burbank Airport for a trip to Seattle. He wore what he wore: jeans, jacket, old boots, the same canvas bag. At the top of the stairs, a young flight attendant was waiting. She was new. First week with Clearwater Aviation, second flight as lead on this aircraft. She had gone through the training. She had seen through the session where a woman described, in specific detail, what it looked like when a flight attendant decided to message before a passenger sat down whether they deserved water. She had sat through it and she had thought, that is the job. That is the whole job. Not the champagne and the protocol. The seeing. When the man in the gray jacket reached the top of the stairs, she smiled at him. Not the professional smile. The real one. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you something before we take off? Water? Coffee? Tea?" "Water would be great," he said. "Thank you. Coming right up." She got it immediately. She brought it to him as he settled into his seat. He took it and looked at her and said, "Thank you." 2 words. "Plain," she said. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything else." She went back to the galley. He looked out the window at the morning light on the tarmac. He thought, yes, that's exactly it. That's the whole of it. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what stayed with you. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.